All right, so this is where we left off in most of the classes. We were talking about kind of groups or ideas that were catalysts to progressivism. And so we talked about like labor unrest. You had kind of the vocal socialist party led by Eugene V. Debs. The progressives were also inspired by the populists, ideas like the graduated income tax, direct election to U.S. senators, the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christians Temperance Union for temperance, social gospel, the idea that Christians, have a moral obligation to help out struggling people in society, and then just middle class America, people that wanted to be better. Remember that I did talk about how that middle class is kind of stuck literally in the middle, and they see because of kind of sensational journalism of muckrakers that there's a potential for chaos and anarchy, and if things don't get better, they're kind of caught in the middle. So remember that progressivism is, for the most part, it's a middle class movement. Some of the people in the old elite, you see Carnegie getting into it with like the gospel of wealth. But for the most part, this is a very much a middle class movement. And one of the first beliefs that we need to understand with how are they going to change things, because a lot of times the progressives, they had ideas about, hey, look, these are the problems, but they didn't really have a lot of solutions. And so one of the things that they thought they needed to do to be able to cure some of these ills of society was to make government larger, right? To make government more powerful. If you're going to regulate the things like the corporations or the industrialists, you need to make government more powerful. You need to increase democracy, let people have more of a voice. That's going to break up those political machines. You take something like the state legislatures, right? Those state legislatures, most of those people in there are in there because of the party machines, and then they're the ones that get to choose the U.S. senators. So make government a little more powerful, allow them to be able to deal with the government's problems. And so there's the middle class. They're sitting there kind of reading their McClures, or not really realizing how much is going on in the lower classes, and the problems, the ills of society, or the political corruption. They're just kind of going on living their lives, and they read about these things, and they're like, oh my gosh, we've got to do something. And so one of the things that they have to do is to take actions by voting and taking political action to change some of these things. Okay, so we cannot forget the importance or the goal, the central role, I guess you could say, of those muckrakers. And so in class, a couple of classes, I talked about these. So I'm going to go through these kind of quickly and just kind of point them out, and then make sure you get a few of them down. So Ida Tarbell, she wrote a scathing expose about the Standard Oil Company and the monopolistic practices of Standard Oil. Lincoln Steffens, who wrote The Shame of the Cities and talked about the living class conditions of the urban poor. Along those same lines, we have Jacob Riis. That's R-I-I-S, Jacob Riis. He wrote a very influential book called How the Other Half Lives. And in that, he took a lot of pictures of urban slums, and it really kind of, he showed it to a lot of middle class and upper middle class, even some wealthy people had read How the Other Half Lives, and they were just shocked about how, the urban poor, how they live, their living conditions, and to some degree, their working conditions. On that note, Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle. The Jungle was really supposed to be kind of a socialist propaganda piece about working conditions, and it was, but it also talked about the conditions of the meatpacking plant that the main character was working in, and how gross it was, and how realistic it was described. And so even people like Theodore Roosevelt read this book, and they're like, my God, is it really like this? And so after further inspection, they found that it was, and that meat inspectors were being bribed and they were corrupt. And so this is going to lead to eventually to things like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. Last one over there that I have on there is E.L. Doctorow. E.L. Doctorow wrote mostly about child labor and kind of some of the other injustices of the Gilded Age in the early 1900s. Okay, so these muckrakers, they really inspired action. They didn't fix a lot of things themselves, but they just exposed it. And you can kind of think of muckrake journalists as almost like sensationalist journalists. I mean, they're investigative journalists is what they really are, but their goal is to kind of shock people. And so in that way, it's kind of like yellow journalism, but kind of different. So their exposés, their articles, their pictures, they kind of inspired reforms in a lot of different ways. And so one of them was in cleaning up government. And so we have very, different levels of kind of reform. The first one we're going to start with is going to be at the kind of the local government level. And the one that you see there on the screen is called the Commission Plan. And so this was created in Galveston, Texas. They had like a really bad storm, really bad tidal wave, and it kind of messed up the town. And they were kind of used it as a way to try a new type of government. So they tried this thing called a commission plan. And so really it was kind of rule by group instead of rule by, a corrupt, party politician or something like that. And so you'd have like the commissioner of sanitation, the commissioner of traffic, the commissioner of whatever, and they would all kind of work together to kind of rule as a group. So that's the commission plan. Another one would be the city manager plan. And so this is where in a municipal government, when I say municipal, I mean city, a mayor or some sort of an elected official, they would bring outside experts in that knew how to run, the economy or gave the mayor advice. But they were kind of a trained professional of some kind that would, give advice, solicit advice. And so that's called the city manager plan. So these are two forms of municipal government. And, a lot of cities adopted them. I mean, there were like 400 cities that adopted the commission plan and several examples of the city manager plan as well. Okay, at the state level, we have the Wisconsin idea. Now, the Wisconsin idea was kind of a state version level of the city manager plan. The guy you can see there is Bob La Follette. He was the kind of the governor of Wisconsin, and he came up with the so-called Wisconsin idea, where he would bring in scientists and efficiency experts, basically just really smart people, and they would kind of tell him, this is what we need to do to make this better, or sanitation better, or traffic better. And so he used smart people to be able to kind of give him advice on how they thought that they needed to run the government. But the key thing here is, who are these people? Well, they're not politicians. They are not people with political interests. They are outside experts who are, have no interest in running the government. They're just trying to help this person make good government. Okay. Next, along the lines of giving people more democratic access so that they can make more of a contribution, they can have more control over their government, and eventually control the bad elements of their government. So the first one is called the Australian secret ballot. States started, this really happened at the state level first, where they would, before the political machines, they would wait with already pre-made, filled out ballots, and they would just give it. They would ask the person, "Are you a Republican or Democrat?" And the person say Democrat, and so the person just give them their ballot already filled out, and you just go hand it in. And that's not very secretive. And so states started using the secret ballot, and the big effect of this is that now you could have what's called split ticket voting. You could vote for Republicans and Democrats. You could vote for this issue or that issue, and the bottom line is it's just not already pre-chosen for you. And this takes the party machines, their control over elections, sort of out of the picture. Okay, the direct primary. Whereas before, state legislatures or party officials, party machines, they would choose the candidates, and then eventually people would get to vote, and then the Electoral College would take over. Well, in the direct primary, what happens now is that parties set forth, 5, 6 candidates, or like the Democrats did this last time, like 20. And then you go through a primary season where these candidates go around from state to state or place to place, and they campaign, and then you whittle it down to the one that the people like the most. But again, this is more access by the people to democracy. Instead of politicians choosing who the presidential candidates are going to be, it's more of they do it initially, but then the people get to choose for their party who they want as their person to run. So that's the direct primary. And that usually happens, several months before the actual presidential election. Okay, I'm going to put these two up together, the initiative and the referendum. So the initiative is kind of like what it sounds. It's where people get to initiate legislation. So they might sign a petition or something like that. If they can get enough petitions, then they will put it on the ballot for the people, the rest of the people to vote on. A referendum could be a couple of different things. States run them a couple of different ways. One of them might be, well, the state government is thinking of passing a law, and it's kind of a controversial law, and so they're just going to put it on the ballot and let the people decide. Or maybe it's already a law, and there's been some blowback on it. People don't really like it, and so they want to know whether they should keep it as a law or not, and they don't want the people getting upset of them for deciding, so the state government puts it on the ballot that year, and then the people decide. But again, whether it's the initiative or referendum, it's kind of like the people getting to bypass their state government. They get a direct voice in what gets passed. And then recall. Recall, the closest thing I can compare recall to is like impeachment. So this is a way for you to remove a state elected official. And whether that's a congressman, usually congressmen, their process is called censorship, which kind of strips them of their lawmaking authority. But for judges and presidents, or in this case, governors, this is a way that you can recall an elected official. You can get them out of office. And so typically what happens is there is an initial recall kind of like petition. And then at that point, then the kind of the state legislature, or it's a referendum back to the people, and the people decide, do you want to keep this governor or do you not? And then they can get rid of that person. So it's like impeachment. All right, last one. This one's going to be a little more of a visual one than I have written down, but direct election of U.S. senators. Okay, so that's going to be the 17th Amendment. We want to write that down. The progressive amendments really are 16, 17, 18, and 19. So I'll probably say this a couple times, but 16 is the graduated income tax. 17 is direct election of U.S. senators that you see here. 18th is going to be prohibition of alcohol, and then 19 is the vote for women's suffrage. And those are going to be the progressive amendments. But here you see the 17th Amendment, increasing democracy. Okay, progress for women. Remember that progress for women starts to occur in the industrial age. You get more jobs that women can do in terms of like switchboard operators or clerks or secretaries or something like that. Remember that during the Civil War, we see women take over the nursing profession. Here you can see a settlement house. So let's remember these settlement houses focused on the urban poor. A lot of times they focused on helping immigrant families get assimilated into American culture and the economy and society. So Jane Addams would be a good example of somebody you should write down in terms of the settlement houses. Hull House, that was probably the most famous of the settlement houses in New York. There are settlement houses in Chicago and some of the other cities as well. Settlement house work is going to lead to another advancement in kind of professional work for women. We know that women start to dominate the field of social workers. And you can kind of see that, a lot of times in counseling, whereas a lot of the counselors are women, they tend to have kind of a softer touch in terms of, listening and sympathy. And so, it's for the last probably really 100 years, women have been dominant in social work. Okay, landmark ruling from the Supreme Court over women in work, Mueller versus Oregon. Just briefly write down about Mueller versus Oregon. It struck down a law that that there was like mandatory work. So the way you should think about Mueller versus Oregon is it limited the amount of work that women can do in factories. And this was kind of actually a divisive ruling because, poor women, they needed to work. But in terms of like what the middle class is trying to accomplish, they see it as they don't think women should work as much, that they should be at home, kind of that cult of domesticity idea. And so Mueller versus Oregon is kind of an interesting ruling because some people thought it was kind of a landmark ruling, and the lower class, they didn't like it because some of them really needed their moms to work. Okay, temperance. Remember, we talked about the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League. Obviously, women not only want temperance because of their husbands, but just their families in general. They think it's a detriment to society, and so in 1918 we get the passage of the 18th Amendment, which prohibits the sale, manufacture, and transportation and trade of alcohol. You also have women that are fighting at various levels to try to clean up the evils of child labor. There's not really necessarily a federal child labor law, but you do need to know that it's during the early part of the 1900s. We do see several states enact child labor laws, and many of them varied. Some of them were between as low as 8 years old, but most of them started to adopt somewhere between 12, 14, and 16 years old for kids. And then probably the most culminating progress for women during the progressive era is obviously the women's suffrage movement. Suffrage kind of took a different turn in the progressive era, where women were seen as kind of the morality of society, where men always didn't see the clear picture, and women kind of saw the emotional side of things that needed to be taken care of. Women were the caretakers of society, and so stuff like temperance and working conditions, those were things that society would rely on women to remedy and fix, and to do that you had to give them the vote. All right, so 19th Amendment. 19th Amendment grants women the right to vote. This is in 1920, which is really kind of the end of the progressive era. All right, in the area of African Americans, we have the creation of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This is a group that is still around today. They are very influential. And the guy that you see pictured here, W.E.B. Du Bois, he was one of the key creators of the NAACP. And one of the things that we see them do is they don't necessarily press for laws to be passed as they did legal challenges to existing laws. And so two of the laws that the NAACP is successfully able to overturn had to do with racism, segregation, and racism. And so in Oklahoma, a law was struck down by the Supreme Court that established poll taxes. There was another case in which there was a segregated neighborhood, and it got challenged, and they struck that down. So there were, we could say, limited success in terms of African Americans. But I think it's probably important that we keep in mind there's no major legal advancements in terms of equal equality, and that's not going to happen on a major level until the 1950s and 60s. So some legal success, but not a whole lot. Another muckraker who was very successful in exposing kind of the evils of racism was Ray Stannard Baker. He wrote an influential book called Following the Color Line that a lot of people ended up reading, and they didn't realize how poorly African Americans got treated. Okay, now we're going to just switch gears. We're going to talk briefly about presidential progressivism, and kind of like what we talked about in class. The guy that really sticks out in terms of progressivism is going to be TR. What is interesting about TR is that as he takes over the presidency, he's really in his conservative phase. He does do a couple of things that are more progressive than other presidents have done, but it won't be until he actually leaves office and then Taft takes over that he really just becomes flat out a liberal. So at first he does some things, but it's not like he just all of a sudden tries to break up every trust. That's kind of a misguided idea. So let's talk about TR. and what he called the square deal. So the square deal just meant whatever he was going to do was going to be fair to all. He wasn't going to favor one group or the other. He wasn't going to favor the corporations, but he wasn't going to favor labor as well. He's just going to try to give everybody the best he could, a fair, or as he called it, a square deal. He kind of gets this reputation as a trust buster, and in some ways he was, but really what he tried to focus on was looking at the difference between a good trust and a bad trust. He and other people recognized that business combinations were actually good for the economy. It allowed the economy to grow. It created jobs. There were a lot of good things about efficiency for some of these combinations, but where he drew the line was, could they create an unfair monopoly where other businesses couldn't compete, where consumers were hurt because they had no other choice in terms of the prices of goods that they were buying? And so TR really worked to differentiate between what he called good trust and bad trust. And then for bad trust, it wasn't like he tried to destroy them as much as he wanted to regulate them. And so when you read in your textbook or you hear about TR, he's not some huge trust buster like he's kind of portrayed as. But really what he is I think a better way, he's a trust regulator. He at least let those combinations know, hey, look, it's not the Wild West anymore. You can't just get away with bloody murder in economics and have no recourse or have no oversight by the government. The government's now watching you. And if you do things that are unfair, we're going to penalize you. We're going to regulate and make sure that you kind of get in line. And that's really what TR did a good job of. Okay, so we're going to see things like, looking out for consumers. So consumer protection. One of the things that TR focused on was consumer protection. All right. The other thing that he focused on was preservation of the environment. Regulating the trust, consumer protection, kind of regulating the use of the environment. And I think it's important to understand that with TR, when he looked at the environment, he didn't see even though he loved nature. I mean, he just absolutely loved it. But he didn't go so far as to say, okay, well, we shouldn't use any of our resources. He did. He wanted to use resources, but he wanted to do them in a sustainable way. He wanted to do it in an economical way that was good for the environment. We wanted to take advantage of our resources, but not crush the environment either. So he's kind of in the middle ground there. All right, so let's talk about control of the corporations. In 1902, he led the breakup of one of J.P. Morgan's investment firms called Northern Securities Company. And, J.P. Morgan's really upset about this. But, this is a kind of a new day and age. And they had this unfair monopoly of investment banking. And so TR kind of put an end to it. Another, let me put this up, sorry. Another good example of TR kind of coming in and being a mediator again was in the anthracite coal mine strike. So this happened in the winter in the early 1900s, and it got to a point where the mine owners were going to, cut wages of the coal miners. So the coal miners were like, fine, well, we're going to walk off, we're going to strike. And this is coming, really close to the dead of winter when we needed coal to heat furnaces and homes. And so TR stepped in and basically mediated, an arbitration between them. And the coal miners ended up giving a 10% wage increase. The workers agreed not to go on strike, and they probably wouldn't have got anything without his help. So, there were examples where he came in and he either mediated or he broke up trusts that were bad. And, breaking up the Northern Securities Company was a good example of that. Okay, other things that he was influential in getting passed in Congress, one was the Elkins Act, which made it so that you could not give preferential rebates to bigger clients. So if I'm a railroad company and I publish my rates, which I'd have to, then I would go to some company that was going to use my railroad to ship like all of their stuff, and it would be a huge boon to my railroad. I could give them like a secret price. I could give them a secret rate. And, this made it to where you had to publish all of your rates, and you had to basically have a quality of those rates. And then the Hepburn Act, I don't know how important the Elkins Act or the Hepburn Act are, But again, maximum freight rates that you could charge for what you're charged on the railroads. So some headway. Okay, consumer protection. TR was inspired by reading The Jungle. This leads to the Meat Inspection Act, the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. I cannot speak. The Food and Drug Administration. And so the Food and Drug Administration, one of the things that they do is that whenever you take medication, for example, it has to be approved by this group so that it is not harmful to your body. And if it is harmful to your body, you have to, by law, list the side effects. And just to give you an example, before the FDA, there were people that used to sell laudanum for headaches. And laudanum was just basically liquid opium. And so, here these people are, they're basically taking like a form of liquid heroin for their headache. And sure, it got rid of their headache, but then they were addicted. But people didn't really know that. And they didn't know, other than just what they felt, that they were getting really addicted to it. And so this is, this kind of limits some of those things from happening. The Meat Inspection Act. When people are processing our food, we need to know that it hasn't been laying on the floor, it hasn't been in a pile of urine or something gross like that. And so this really cleaned up the way meat was inspected as it was then shipped out to consumers. Things like expiration dates, things like that would be very important because of the Meat Inspection Act. Same thing with the Pure Food and Drug Act, like I talked about. The FDA is the regulatory agency that looks over what kind of things get put out to the public. Make sure the public's safe. Okay, conservation. There's really two schools of thought for conservation. You have Gifford Pinchot, okay? And Gifford Pinchot, he was really the first guy that runs the Forest Service. So you think about him in terms of rational use, okay? And that's what we want to kind of put down around him, is that he oversaw the forest of the areas, and he saw the forest as a great resource to use. Chop down trees, but also at the same time, make sure that you replant them. Whatever it was, just responsible environmental use. So that's Gifford Pinchot. Okay, and so you see things like dams. Like, he was crucial in getting dams put in areas to where they could then dam up a river, create a lake that's going to create flood control, drought control. Obviously, you can recreate on it too, but then you can irrigate crops with it. And so, responsible use of the environment. Now, one of the biggest laws that's passed out that impacts the West is the Newlands Act. And so I think it's officially called the Reclamation Act, but I think everybody kind of calls it the Newlands Act. But this provided for federal dollars to create reservoirs, federally funded reservoirs, federally funded canals, federally funded dams that would then be used to eventually to produce things like electricity, to make these lakes to where they could then store water that could be used for irrigation for farming. All right, now on the other end of the spectrum, you're going to see TR there with a guy by the name of John Muir. So let's kind of talk about John Muir. John Muir is the preservation guy. So let me go back really quickly. You kind of need to know the difference between conservation and preservation. So conservation is the idea where, hey, we're going to protect certain parts of our country, but we are going to use them, and we're going to use them in a responsible way. Whereas preservation is, you're not going to use it at all. So this is kind of like the national park system. Okay? And Gifford Pinchot, he was one of the founding members of the Sierra Club, which continues to be one of the most powerful lobbying groups today to Congress. The Sierra Club, they are at the extreme end of environmental protection. And so, this group is going to be very key in the 1970s of passing the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And they don't, they want to get pieces of land that the government can't touch, private companies can't touch, and they want to, they want to just reserve that land for nothing really more than tourism. So if you think like some of the places that they were able to take out of consideration for any kind of development at all. So like Yosemite National Park, Canyonlands, Grand Canyon, Yellowstone would be another good example of this. Like, Rocky Mountain National Park. These are all These are all places where literally you can't have any kind of economic development. So that's kind of at the extreme end. And Roosevelt was sort of caught in the middle between the two guys, between John Muir and Gifford Pinchot. And he sort of tended to lead towards Gifford Pinchot because as much as he liked nature, he also realized that we should use it. If we use it smart and like replant trees or make sure that, whatever wildlife can be, taken somewhere and transplanted, that we should use our resources. Whereas John Muir tended to get upset with TR a little bit because he was at the other end. He was a preservationist. Okay. And really the thing that upset Gifford Pinchot and John Muir the most with each other was the idea of the Hetch Hetchy project in California. And so the Hetch Hetchy was this, you can kind of see it, there's this really beautiful looking valley, and it was perfect. It was walled up, perfect for a dam. And so this would have created a reservoir that would bring down water into San Francisco. San Francisco was kind of short on fresh water. And so the idea was to dam up the Hetch Hetchy area in California and bring down water to San Francisco. And John Muir just got furious with TR about that he was going to do it. And so that's kind of where they split a little bit. But they ended up doing it, and they ended up putting in a big dam there. I believe it's still there. So that's the kind of the Hetch Hetchy controversy. All right, so we are finished. I will go over the policies of Taft and Wilson on Monday. Thank you for tuning in, and have a good weekend.